My name is Hugo Pope, and I am a collector of rarities. It is a collection I have amassed over some time and at considerable cost, and it is, quite rightly, regarded as among the most expansive in the world. It is an eclectic mix of items books, jewelry, artworks, medical specimens, even properties, and any number of less quantifiable artifacts. But they all have one thing in common each has a rather macabre story behind it. Some of my peers may find such a thing distasteful, but they don't see the beauty that can be found in the shadows of one is just prepared to look. People often speak of the fruits of blood, sweat, and tears, but how many of them ever really stop to think about what that phrase truly entails? My most recent acquisition is also one of the rarest and one that has eluded me for many a year. I have always derived the greatest pleasure from the creative output of some of the world's most misunderstood minds. I have a number of paintings on my walls by some of the most notorious death row inmates. I have one of only 4 copies of the supposedly cursed novel The Glass Missionary. I even have a grainy but highly convincing copy of the infamous video The Tortoise. Yet the art that moves me most is, and always has been, music. As such, I have taken great interest, bordering on the fanatical if the truth be told, in collecting the compositions of those rare individuals who are not just prepared to accept their inner darkness, but to embrace it. I first heard about the Abattoir Concerto at least 20 years ago. It was from a fellow collector, an Englishman named Julian Call, who delightedly regaled me with all the ghoulish details of the piece's backstory in his parlor. "You mean to tell me," he gasped with mock surprise and poorly concealed glee, "that you've never heard of Lucien Mortimer?" I regarded him coolly over the top of my brandy glass, then nodded curtly, a begrudging confession of my ignorance. "Well, well, old chap," he cried, clapping his hands together as his heavy-lidded eyes widened in excitement. "Do allow me to enlighten you." I had to repress the urge to roll my eyes as the incorrigible old ham basked in the moment, yet I listened on. "Lucien Mortimer," Cole began theatrically, "was arguably the most successful butcher in the East End of London during the latter days of Queen Victoria's reign. He had not one, not two, but no fewer than 4 large slaughterhouses, butchering hundreds of animal carcasses each day. His meat was very much sought after, not just by the poor common people of the East End, but by the nobility of London's more opulent suburbs. When it came to flesh, Mortimer was quite the artiste." Call grinned at me in the flickering firelight, his lean visage all the more cadaverous in the eerie glow. "But he was so much more than that. Rumors spread among the citizens of London that Mortimer was also an occultist. One was that he had acquired a thirst for knowledge of an otherworldly bent, and, self-educated as he was, he read everything he could on the beings that more superstitious folk might dub demons." I shifted in my seat, intrigued by this development in a story while Call continued. "Word spread that Mortimer might even have communed with such beings, and he soon gathered a flock of loyal followers. One can understand why." Call licked his lips in relish as he went on. "Mortimer was a giant of a man. Some of the more nonsensical stories of the time claim he stood nearly 10 feet tall." I snorted in disbelief, a sound that drew an irritated glance from Call. "Of course, that was merely excited exaggeration. My own research suggests that he was actually a fraction over 7 feet tall, which is almost unheard of in that day and age." He noticed my cocked eyebrow and smiled smugly. "I've managed to obtain one of the man's shirts. He must have been very impressive indeed." I gritted my teeth and attempted to smile back, seeing that his collection could have such an artifact while mine went without. Right there and then, I swore to myself that I would have the last laugh here. "He was said to have a deep, booming voice and dark, blazing eyes. His acolytes were utterly devoted to him and followed him blindly. Soon rumors spread of unholy rituals conducted after dark in his slaughterhouses." Call went forward then, lowering his voice for effect. "Stories of sacrifices. But, nevertheless, the local constabulary kept their distance. You see, several members of Mortimer's flock were from well-to-do families, some of Victorian society's wealthiest and most influential dynasties. So, fearful of invoking the wrath of these individuals, the authorities turned a blind eye to the disturbing accusations leveled towards Lucien Mortimer and his followers." Call paused to take a sip of his brandy, the fire crackling gently in the background. His eyes crinkled playfully from beneath his domed forehead, the small black skullcap he wore in stark contrast to his graying hair. "But that changed after the performance," he whispered. I questioned, curious despite my best efforts to not encourage Call's flamboyance. "Oh, yes," he cried, raising one finger to emphasize his point. "The performance of the Abattoir Concerto." He paused for dramatic effect, taking another lengthy sip of his brandy before continuing. "Mortimer's masterpiece. An untrained musician, Lucian Mortimer taught himself to read music so that he might create it. A process that took the man 6 long years of painstaking work, in which he tinkered and retinkered with his composition until finally he deemed it complete. It was the only piece he ever wrote. You know," he said, leaning in conspiratorially, glancing from side to side as if afraid of being overheard, "they say he may have been guided by the otherworldly beings from whom he had gained power. That this was his way of repaying them for the success they had afforded him over the years." I scoffed again, but this time it was a less convincing sound, and it was met by a twitch of Call's lip beneath his hooked nose. There was considerable demand to hear the piece when finally he declared its completion. His acolytes had told their wealthy families and friends that it was a piece that transcended mere music. When it was announced that there was to be a performance of the Abattoir Concerto, demand was feverish, and tickets exchanged hands for princely sums. When it was revealed that Mortimer would perform the piece at the largest of his slaughterhouses, the gentry were whipped into a frenzy of anticipation by the thought of attending such a ghoulish setting. Finally, the night of the performance came, and the giggling audience filed through the high doors into the slaughterhouse, resplendent in their jewelry, furs, and finery. When the last of them took their seat, Mortimer's followers closed and barred the doors behind them. Call sank back into his seat and proceeded to refill his brandy glass from the decanter behind his chair. It was simply too much to take. "Yes, well, and then?" I barked, my frustration getting the better of me. "Darn you, Julian, just get on with it." Call laughed then, that throaty chuckle of his that never ceases to infuriate me, before raising his palms to me in a placatory gesture. Of course. Give me a moment, old boy. The truth is, nobody really knows what happened in the slaughterhouse that night. It wasn't until 9 the following morning that anybody else ventured inside the building. It was a group of policemen, following up on the anxious reports that the attendees that evening had never returned home. Upon breaking down the door, the policemen bore witness to a scene of carnage unlike any they had ever seen before. Later, one of the officers, a man who had been in attendance at the scene where Mary Kelly was found murdered and dismembered by Jack the Ripper, said that the interior of the slaughterhouse made the Ripper's work look like child's play. There were no signs of life, not even a hint of Mortimer's flock and the wealthy ticket holders who had attended the performance, at least not at first glance. However, the floors and walls were spattered with gore and viscera. Call rolled the R's theatrically, savoring the feel of the words on his tongue. And the meat hooks that hung around the building were adorned with fresh meat, but it wasn't cattle or mutton this time. They'd all been butchered, I muttered darkly. Oh, but maybe not, Call exclaimed animatedly. You see, while the initial reports claimed that everybody at the building that night had been murdered by an unknown assailant, many years later one of the policemen was said to have made a startling confession. With his dying breath, this policeman, one Anthony Brown, claimed that while it was true that the remains discovered at the scene were those of Mortimer's followers and guests, upon closer inspection they discovered one survivor from that fateful night, Mortimer himself. Upon spying the colossal, blood-soaked butcher hiding behind hanging carcasses, a cry rang out and Mortimer attempted to flee. Finally, the policeman cornered the man on the roof, where, wielding a large cleaver of his trade, the fugitive Mortimer was said to have put up a frightful struggle, one which saw 2 policemen lose their lives, and Brown himself maimed and disfigured. Finally, the constabulary were able to overpower their monstrous quarry, yet, despite the horrors he had already witnessed, it was what happened next that haunted Brown until his dying day. I leant forward eagerly. It pains me to say it, but at this point I was captivated by Call's tale and desperate to hear it through to conclusion. Incensed by the loss of their friends and comrades, appalled at the shocking discretion of the human form that they had witnessed in the slaughterhouse below, the policemen decided to mete out justice of their own. They dragged the struggling, screaming Mortimer down into the bowels of the building, where they hung him on his own meat hooks, the man's own cruel steel piercing his flesh, suspending him above the ground in agony as slowly the life bled out of him. Call grinned again as he added, "Brown said it took Mortimer nearly 2 hours to die." Suddenly, Call clapped his hands together, breaking the spell his macabre story had woven and causing me to start with an involuntary exclamation. "So there you have it," he said, his tone conversational and normal once more. "The grim tale of Lucy and Mortimer." I pondered his story for a moment, then voiced the doubts that sprang into my mind. "And quite the tale it is, I acquiesced. But it seems to be one built on gossip and hearsay, and very little of much substance." "Not at all," Call protested, agitated. "The murders at the Whitechapel slaughterhouse are a matter of public record, and were widely reported in the newspapers at the time. I believe I have an evening edition of the Standard which broke the news." Bristling at Call's continued bragging, I snapped, "And these reports corroborate this policeman Brown's story?" "To a degree," Call said coolly. "The bodies are all accounted for, but something is not." "Oh?" I replied curiously. "The sheet music. The Abattoir Concerto." "But surely that was just a ruse," I interjected. "A means to lure Mortimer's victims to the scene so he and his minions could sacrifice them." "You might think so," Call replied, nodding. "But there was something listed among the evidence recovered at the scene that makes me wonder. You see, as well as the bodies and belongings of Mortimer's flock and their victims, it was reported that the wrecked remains of a grand piano were also discovered at the scene." My eyes widened at this revelation, as Call curled his lip in disdain and went on. "Scrivens, the bloody charlatan, claimed to have recently obtained one of the keys from the piano for his own collection." Call shrugged dismissively as he said, "Absolute balderdash, of course. It's clearly a fake. I have it on good authority that the remains of the piano were destroyed in a fire at a police warehouse some 15 years later." "Could the sheet music have suffered that same fate?" I asked. "Who knows?" Call replied with a wiry grin. "It may forever be lost to the passage of time." We sat in silence for some time, sipping our brandy. Yet, despite the lack of conversation, we both understood what had happened right there. The gauntlet had been thrown down. The game was now on. Our race had begun. The hunt for the Abattoir Concerto was long, twisting and turning pursuit that consumed me over the years. Yes, my collection grew impressively, and I obtained items that other collectors might have killed to possess, yet all along my failure to secure that sheet music haunted me. And sometimes I felt I was near to making a breakthrough, and I became overjoyed at the very thought of it. At others, I heard Julian Call was drawing close to having it in his grasping clutches, and I despaired. Yet days turned to weeks, weeks to months, months to years, and still the Abattoir Concerto eluded us both. Over the years, I learned to play the piano, paid for the finest tutor money could buy, so that when the day came that I finally laid hands on the sheet music, I would be able to play it myself, to hear the work that had gained such infamy. On some occasions, the game between Call and myself became rather underhanded, but that is the nature of pursuits such as this. I once paid an air traffic controller a considerable sum to delay Call's jet on a runway so I could get to a lead before him. Call himself bribed an eminent scholar and expert on British history to feed me a steady stream of false information that sent me on a wild goose chase to Edinburgh in Scotland, of all places. We both cursed the other's name on multiple occasions, yet on those times in which we came face to face, we always regarded one another with the begrudging respect that one can only feel towards a truly worthy adversary. Yes, we were rivals, but in a lot of ways, Julian Call is the closest thing I've ever had to a best friend. My investigation led me to many far-flung locations, From a supposedly haunted house in the British countryside to an abandoned lighthouse, to the abandoned tube tunnels beneath London's bustling streets. I even spoke with a paranormal investigator here in the States, a funny young fellow by the name of Roman Proudlock, who had heard of Mortimer and the beings with whom he was said to have communed. He tried to warn me against pursuing this course of action, said that the entities that guided Mortimer are among the most dangerous in this or any other plane of existence. I scoffed. There's no room for superstition among collectors such as I, and assured Mr. Proudlock that I would take all due precautions on my research. He gave me names and contact details for occultists who have become valuable assets in building my collection, but sadly, none of them were able to provide me with any concrete leads. It proved a most frustrating endeavor, but still I soldiered on. I would not be dissuaded. I could not. Finally, the breakthrough came, just 1 month ago. I'm sure you can imagine my surprise when, after all of the effort and resources I had expended in my efforts to locate the Abattoir Concerto, it was an unsolicited phone call that would deliver it to me. I sit on the board of a number of companies, some of which are very wide-reaching indeed. These firms have benefited from my ruthless and calculating business acumen, and in exchange for my guidance I receive a handsome financial reward, an essential asset to collectors such as myself. It was the receptionist at one of these companies who called me during lunch, apologizing profusely but claiming to have a man on the line who said I needed to speak with him. I was livid to have my dining interrupted and assured the receptionist that if this call were to be a waste of my time, it would also prove to be a waste of her career. She apologized once again, but said the gentleman was quite insistent. I sighed resignedly, then instructed her to transfer the call. The call sounded awful, and had a hissing and stuttering quality that led me to believe it was coming from overseas. This deduction was quickly confirmed when the man at the other end began to speak. "Hello, is that Mr. Pope?" The guttural yet nasal Cockney accent of a native Londoner. "This is he," I replied coolly. "I hear you've been looking for something," the man went on. "A piece of music, is that right?" "That would depend on the piece in question," I said. Might I inquire as to what exactly it is to which you are referring?" The Cockney laughed, a hoarse, scratchy sound. He was clearly a smoker and almost certainly a heavy drinker, too. "Yeah, you might, Mr. Pope, you might," he said. "I'm talking about the Abattoir Concerto. Someone told me you want it, and I've got it." "Might be of interest," I replied, still skeptical of the man's claim. "If it is genuine." "My old great-uncle seemed to think it was. Kept it in his safe, he did. I'm the only one left of our family, so now it's mine." He paused, and I could hear the cogs of his mind turning before he spoke once more. "Which means it could be yours." "I'm sorry, sir," I replied, "but you have me at somewhat of a disadvantage. I don't believe I caught your name." "Oh, right you are, Mr. Pope," he replied. "My name is Fred Brown." Brown. The name of the policeman maimed at Mortimer Slaughterhouse. It was too preposterous to comprehend. "Oh, please, Mr. Brown," I cried indignantly. "Is this really the best that you and Call could conjure up between you? You can tell Julian that he's losing his touch." "I ain't working with a Mr. Call," Brown barked. "But I can if you don't meet my terms." As a businessman, I pride myself on my ability to read people, my aptitude at deriving hidden meaning from intonation. There was something in Brown's voice that gave me cause for thought. A little flustered, I attempted to wrest control of the situation from the other man. "I don't mean to cause any offense, Mr. Brown, but you will understand my wariness. If you have in your possession that which you claim to have, this is something that many individuals have sought for a great number of years. Perhaps you could convince me as to its authenticity." "I can tell you that my great-uncle's old man, Tony, was old Bill. A copper," he said, picking up on my confusion. "Old Tony didn't have 3 fingers on his left, and he had a great big scar running down his boat race." Ah, rhyming slang. Boat race. Face. I have conducted extensive research on Lucien Mortimer over the years, but I have not limited my attention to him. I have looked into each of his followers, his victims, and the men who discovered the scene. The description given to me by the man on the phone matched Anthony Brown in all ways but one. Were these the only ways in which old Tony was left altered by his encounter with Lucien Mortimer? I asked. Brown chuckled again, a thick and throaty sound.
No,
he laughed.
You know what happened to him? Cleaver sliced straight through him. He limped right up until the day he died.
I froze. The detail about the nerve damage in his upper leg and lower back caused by Mortimer's assault was one that very few people knew. Brown was who he claimed to be. The Cockney laughed again at my stunned silence.
I reckon that probably convinced you, ain't that right, Mr. Poe?
You mentioned terms, I stammered. What do you want, Mr. Brown?
I want you to come to me, he said. I've got a room over the Leather Apron in Whitechapel. You come to me, we'll talk about a price for the music, alright?
Listen here, Brown, I shan't be held to ransom, I blustered.
No, Mr. Pope, of course you won't, he laughed. Cheerio, then.
I was in the air and flying towards Gatwick Airport within the hour. The whole time I sat staring out of the window, not really seeing anything, nervously drumming my fingertips on the tray before me. Could it be? I thought, scarcely daring to believe that my long search might finally be over. Could it be? The black cab pulled up outside the squat brick building with frosted glass windows a little after 8 p.m. GMT. A battered old sign hung outside, swinging gently in the cold wind. The Leather Apron. There was an icy mist of drizzling rain hanging in the air, the dark sky threatening worse weather yet.
You sure you want to get out here, mate?
The driver asked as I stepped out onto the litter-strewn street.
This is a bit of a rough boozer.
My security guard, Marcus, handed over a well-worn 50-pound note and instructed the cab driver to await our return. A former Marine, at 6 foot 5 inches and thickly muscled, Marcus had very little to fear, which means I didn't either, so I dismissed the driver's concerns with a casual wave of my hand. Marcus opened the umbrella over my head, sheltering me from the rain.
This way, Mr. Pope,
he rumbled, heading towards the dark wooden doors of the Leather Apron. There was a low chattering hubbub of voices in conversation within. Somewhere a woman laughed loudly and coarsely. The stench of stale ale wafted out to me, causing me to screw up in my nose in revulsion. Let's resolve this as expediently as possible, shall we? I suggested and pushed open the door. Ugly, peeling flock wallpaper adorned the walls, while a heavily stained carpet seemed to stick and tug at my shoes as I walked in and out of the rain. At least 35 people sat around inside the pub, perched on rickety wooden stools huddled together in groups of 2 or 3, each of them nursing pint glasses of Jaeger and ale. Each and every one of them ceased their conversation to stare at the damp interlopers who had joined them in the musty interior. A man stood by a heavily scarred dartboard, frozen, his tattooed right arm still raised, the dart unthrown. The men curled their lips contemptuously towards me, then hurriedly looked away when their gaze met with that of Marcus. Behind the bar, an overweight woman with straw-like bleached hair and an unseemly amount of cleavage on display peered at us over the top of the pint glass she was drying with a towel.
Evening,
she said, flashing us a smile that never reached her eyes.
What can I get you, gents?
Good evening, madam, I smiled, approaching the bar, but taking every care not to touch its murky surface. I have an appointment with a Mr. Brown. I believe he resides here?
Fred?
She smiled mirthlessly, then pointed.
In the corner, love.
I followed her gesture to the far corner of the pub. A man sat alone, watching us with a wiry grin on his face. At least I thought it was a grin. The man's visage was a mass of scars, which pulled his features into a barely human mask. One particularly deep wound crisscrossed his left eye, which was milky white in his red face. I felt an involuntary shudder of revulsion as I realized that the tip of the man's nose appeared to have been amputated, and his left ear was missing, leaving an ugly hole in the side of his pudgy head. Slowly and awkwardly, the man shuffled to his feet as Marcus and I walked to meet him. "Mr. Brown?" I asked, extending my hand to shake his. Brown nodded, smiling even wider as he glanced down at his own right hand. I hurriedly withdrew my own when I realized that Brown sported a prosthetic limb, shiny plastic with 3 metallic hooks where his fingers should have been.
Nice to meet you, Mr. Pope, he rumbled. And you too, Mr.
Marcus remained silent, watching Brown suspiciously.
Right.
Brown grinned.
I don't know why you've brought this geezer along, Mr. Pope.
He held a prosthesis under my nose.
As you can see, I'm armless.
A wide spread around the pub, and Brown winked the unseeing left eye at his appreciative audience. I'm sure... You understand the prudence of precaution, Mr. Brown, I responded, ignoring his ill-judged quip. Just as I'm sure you appreciate the value of my time. Shall we commence with our negotiations? I mean no offense, but I should like to ascertain the authenticity of the piece.
No worries, Mr. Pope.
Brown flashed me another gap-toothed smile.
Come up to my room and we can commence.
Brown reached for a dark wooden walking stick beside him. As he limped across the sticky carpet, I noticed an odd hollow sound to his footsteps. It seemed the arm wasn't his only prosthetic limb. The stairway up to the room over the pub was accessed by a narrow door by the restrooms. As we huddled in the foul-smelling passage, Brown gestured towards Marcus with his hook.
I think a giant haystack's over there can wait here,
he growled. Marcus shook his head, an emphatic no.
Then the deal's off, Mr. Pope,
Brown declared.
Bloke that size decides he's gonna take that sheet music off me, there ain't much I can do about it, is there? I'm not taking that risk.
I stood and contemplated the situation. Let Marcus see the room, so he knows you have no accomplices lying in wait. Then he waits outside the door, I suggested. The patrons of this establishment have seen both Marcus and myself. You know who I am and from where I have come. You can easily alert the authorities as to our identity before we can flee London. Agreed? Brown considered my proposition, then, to my relief, nodded.
Up we go, then,
he smiled. There was no sign of any bandits preparing to ambush me in Brown's room. In truth, it was too small to accommodate them. A small, unmade single bed with stained sheets sat in one corner, an old television set on a bedside table with an overflowing ashtray beside it. There was a microwave with splatters of sauce on the glass door, beside a lime-scale-encrusted basin. Across the room, a rickety wardrobe leaned haphazardly to one side, seeming to slouch against an overflowing bookshelf for support. The room stank of stale sweat, cigarette smoke, Indian food, and rancid beer. After Marcus peered through the door, he said,
I'll be right outside the door, Mr. Pope,
fixing Brown with a pointed glare before closing the door right behind him. The Cockney stood watching me for a moment before quietly saying,
Are you sure you want this, Mr. Pope? It's not too late to walk away.
He spoke without any hint of the bravado he had demonstrated in front of the drinkers in the bar downstairs, and I found myself a little mystified by the sudden change in his demeanor. I'm here at your request, Brown, I smiled. I've wasted a great deal of time already, and I should like to conclude our business before any more is wasted. I don't know what you hope to accomplish with this latest gambit, but my patience is beginning to wear thin. For a second, Brown's face twisted, as if he were struggling with a decision, but no sooner had I noticed the expression than it was replaced with that same easy, knowing grin.
Very well, Mr. Pope,
he growled.
Very well.
Suddenly, he turned on his heel, a surprisingly swift movement considering his disability, and clumped across the room to the bookshelves. He rummaged through the dog-eared paperbacks and tatty-covered magazines. Aha, he said, turning back to flash me a vaguely lewd wink and pulling something from the shelf. As he limped towards me, I saw that it was a piece of adult material, a dull-eyed woman in cheap nylon lingerie gazing from the cover in what was supposedly meant to be a seductive manner. My face obviously betrayed my disdain, as Brown chuckled, then held it up to offer me a better look.
You read this one?
He wheezed with a smirk of amusement. I must have missed it, I replied stonily. The music, Mr. Brown?
All right.
The scarred Cockney replied as he opened the magazine. With a shaking hand, he retrieved some yellowing scraps of paper from inside. I don't know how to explain the feeling that washed over me at that moment, but I can only describe it as a sudden, unwavering, and unshakable certainty. I knew, as soon as I saw those tattered sheets, that I had finally found it. My life's goal was within my grasp. My word, I muttered, unable to mask my emotions. Brown smiled sadly at me.
"I know," he said hoarsely. "So I reckon you've been looking for this. I reckon it's been waiting for you too."
I could feel the sweat under my shirt despite the cold London night drawing in. My palms were slick, my mouth dry as, hesitantly, I reached for the sheets in Brown's hand. "May I?" I stammered. Brown hesitated, pulling the music away from me a fraction, an involuntary reaction. I don't know what I would have done had Fred Brown refused to continue with the deal. I'm not a violent man, nor am I one who often resorts to physical effort when I can pursue a more cerebral course, but as Brown stood between the Abattoir Concerto and I felt an urge to set upon him, to rain blows down upon his misshapen and scarred head. Thankfully, Brown averted this course when he sighed heavily and wearily, then passed me the papers. I took them gently, reverentially, my heart racing as I took in the distinctive looping signature of Lucien Mortimer on the first page. Tears sprang unbidden to my eyes. "It really is," I whispered. "Oh, my word. It really is." I turned my attention to Brown, beaming maniacally in his direction. "Your price, Mr. Brown. What price for the piece?"
"I reckon a piece like that is worth what, 50 grand?
I almost laughed in his disfigured face. £50,000? I would have paid 20 times that sum. Very well, I nodded, trying to conceal my glee. Marcus has an attaché case with the money. May I retrieve it? Brown nodded, then held out his good hand, which now I noticed was missing 2 fingers.
"I'll take that while you do, though, Mr. Pope."
I experienced a terrible wrenching sensation as I handed back the Abattoir Concerto, an irrational fear that if I left the room now, both the sheet music and the scarred cockney would have vanished upon my return. Of course, my concerns were unfounded. After removing Brown's fee from the case, which left the case still practically full with banknotes, I returned and found him glancing wistfully at the sheet music. He took his payment, not pausing to count it or check the authenticity of the notes. He was distracted and stared at the music with a look of yearning as I carefully placed each sheet in a sterile plastic bag, taking every care to preserve Mortimer's masterpiece. Finally, our business was concluded, but I needed to ask something before I left. "Mr. Brown," I inquired, "have you, My eyes darted to the hole on the side of his head where once an ear had been. Brown followed my gaze and grinned sadly.
"Have I heard it, Mr. Pope?" Yeah, I have."
"How is it?" I asked. Tears suddenly sprang from Brown's eyes, trickling down his scarred cheeks.
"It's magnificent," he whispered. "You'll never be the same once you've heard it."
I nodded, suddenly eager to be far from this fetid little hovel and back in my own home. "Very well," I replied, starting for the door and flinging it wide, revealing the alert and attentive face of Marcus in the dim hallway beyond. "A pleasure doing business with you." Brown barely responded, instead staring down at his prosthetic arm, slowly shaking his head. As I closed the door behind me, he finally spoke softly, 2 quiet words full of misery.
"I wasn't."
Even with the Abattoir Concerto and the attaché case firmly cuffed to Marcus's thick wrist, I was paranoid that it might yet be snatched away from me. I glanced anxiously from side to side as we walked out into the wet London night and over to the waiting cab. As we drove through dark streets towards the airport, I wiped at the foggy windows, glaring mistrustfully at any headlights behind us. I bristled as we passed through security at the VIP departure lounge at the airport, breaking into a cold sweat when the case left my sight briefly while it went through the X-ray machine. Even as we sat in our spacious seats on board the plane, I clutched the case close to my chest, alert for any signs of chicanery from Julian Call's lackeys. It never came. The drive from the airport back to my home was the most fraught yet. A freeway pileup that supposedly killed a man and a woman at the scene and left another man and a child hospitalized sent us on a lengthy detour. I became convinced that this was an elaborate ruse to send us into an ambush. I stared intensely into the trees either side of the road. They were covered in missing child posters, but I never saw the boy's face, instead scanning the woods for any sign of thieves. Finally, as the iron gates at my home clanged closed behind my vehicle, I breathed a sigh of relief, then laughed loud and triumphantly. After so many years, so much work, so much heartache, the Abattoir Concerto was mine.